Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and tonight we're going to be learning how to play the 1 to 4 player game Shelfie Stacker from Arcus Games. Shelfie Stacker comes with all of the components that you see here, including 88 total dice, a score pad, 4 Shelf of Shame dashboards, 4 Big Shelf dashboards, 12 First to Claim cards, 12 End of Game cards, 4 Shelfie Sidekick cards, a dice bag, 6 delivery boxes, and 4 different decks of 16 character cards. To begin setup, give each player a big shelf, 1 Shelf of Shame, a reference card, and a set of 8 character cards. At the start of every game, players will typically pick 8 of their 16 character cards and return all of the others to the box face down. Players would keep their selected cards hidden from the other players, but for the first game, the rulebook recommends that each player just use cards 1 through 8 from their set of character cards. In the center of the table, place 1 more delivery box than the number of players. So in our 2-player example, we would place 3 delivery boxes in the center of the table. Then you'll place dice of each color into the bag. The number of dice placed in the bag will vary depending on the player count. In our 2-player game, we'll remove 10 dice of each color. Place all of the dice in the bag and then mix them thoroughly. Any dice that are left over can be placed in the box. Then shuffle the stack of End of Game, Shelfie Sidekick, and First to Claim cards, and place 1 card from each stack face up in the play area. Any cards that are left over can be placed in the box. They won't be used for this game. After this has been done, you're ready to play. A game of Shelfie Stacker will last 7 rounds, and each round will follow the same structure. The first step of each round is to fill the delivery boxes. Players will draw and place 3 dice from the bag onto each of the delivery boxes. Players shouldn't roll the dice, but they shouldn't be manipulated in any way when being placed on the boxes. Each player will then select one of their character cards in secret to play for the round. The character card will determine 2 things. The number in the top left of the card will determine player order, and the card will also have a special ability that could be activated during this round or during future rounds by the player. After each player has selected a character card, they would place them face down above their big shelf. After everyone has placed their character card, all players will simultaneously reveal the character cards that they chose. The player with the lowest number in the top left of their character card would go first, and if there's a tie, the letter in the bottom right of the card would break the tie. In this example, the blue player would go first because their A beats the C on the green player's card. Also, it's important to note that the letters in each color are randomized. There are some green cards that will beat a blue card in a tie. It's not inherently better to play blue. It's also important to note that each card has a special ability that can be used in this round that's coming up or in any future round for the player that selected that card. To indicate that a card's special ability can still be used, this turn order card would be left face up next to the player's big shelf until it's used. And players can have multiple character cards face up along their big shelf. These will remain there until the player decides to use their ability. Once a character's special ability has been used, you can flip it over or place it underneath your big shelf, whatever way that you would like to indicate that the card's ability has been used. We'll go over each of these cards' special abilities at the end of the video. Once the turn order has been determined by the player character cards, each player will select one of the delivery boxes and the 3 dice that are on top of them. So for instance, let's say that the blue player and the green player took these 2 delivery boxes. After the boxes have been collected, it's then time for the players to place their dice into their big shelves or their Shelf of Shame. It's important to note that players have to place all of the dice on their box each round. And when placing dice, there are some basic rules that apply. Each column always has to be filled from the bottom to the top. Once a color of die is placed in one of the columns on your big shelf, that column now has to have that same color of dice placed in it going forward. And any dice that are placed in this column going forward have to increase in value. So for instance, if any dice are placed in this column going forward, they would have to be green dice and they would have to be a 5 or higher. As you can see, starting on the bottom level with lower dice could be beneficial. So let's say that the blue player decides to use their Bargain Hunter ability right away and flip one of the dice in their box to the opposite side. To indicate this, they could flip the card over and then change one of the dice in their box to the opposite value. In this instance, they've chosen to change this 4 to a 3. When it comes to placing sixes, sixes are wild, and anytime a player has a value 6 die in their box, they can physically change it to any value. And you can trigger a 6 in that way even if you use an ability to turn a die into a 6. For instance, if this die had have been a 1 and the player used their special ability to change it into a 6, they could then change that 6 to any value that they wanted to because once again, sixes are wild. But let's say for instance that the player decided to change this 6 to a 1 and place it on their shelf. This would now give them plenty of flexibility to build on the purple column later in the game. If a player can't place a die into their big shelf or they don't want to place a die into their big shelf, they have to place it into their shelf of shame. Each die placed into the shelf of shame is worth -2 victory points at the end of the game, and there's no limit on how many dice can be placed here, even though there's space for 9 dice. After everyone has placed all of their dice, you'll then go into cleanup. All of the dice remaining on the unchosen box will be placed back in the bag, and then players will place their delivery boxes back into the middle to prepare for the next round. The next round will then begin with step 1, refilling the boxes. Players will continue to play this way until 7 rounds have been completed, at which point the game will end. But before we talk about game end, we need to discuss the 3 cards face up in the middle of the table. There are 3 types of reward cards in the game. The first reward card is the Shelfie Sidekick. Each of these cards will work in a similar way. The first player that's able to collect at least 3 dice of the depicted color on the card will be able to claim the card. And if multiple people are able to achieve this goal in the same round, turn order will break the tie. The Shelfie Sidekick can be stolen later in the game, however. If the player is able to get more dice of the depicted color on their big shelf, this card would then go to them. But if there's a tie, the card would remain where it is. If a player is able to keep this card until the end of the game, it will give them victory points. The first to claim reward cards will have a particular pattern depicted on the card. The first player that's able to create that pattern exactly on their big shelf would be able to claim the card. Unlike the Shelfie Sidekick, this card can't be stolen. Once it's claimed, it belongs to the player who first achieved the goal. And once again, if multiple people are able to achieve this pattern on the same round, turn order would determine who gets the card. It's important to note that this pattern can't be rotated or flipped at all. It has to be exactly as depicted on the card. And it doesn't matter what's below or above the pattern so long as these dice exist somewhere on the big shelf. And the last type of card to look at are the end of game cards. End of game cards will give players a particular goal to go for at the end of the game to score extra points. For instance, this card would give players 5 points at the end of the game for every set of 1 and 2 valued dice they have. This card would give players bonus points for each column that they have with an odd number die at the top. And this card would give players points for each pair of columns that they have of the same color and same height. Once 7 rounds have been played, the game will end, and then players will score points based on these criteria. Players will gain 6 points for every column that's reached the top shelf of their big shelf board. Players will score 3 points for every column that ends at this height. Players will score 1 point for every column that ends at this height. And then players will score 1 point for each pip value on the highest die of each column of their board. For instance, this player would score 5 points here, 5 points here, and 6 points for these 3 columns. Then players would score points from any reward cards that they were able to claim, and the end of game card if they were able to meet any of the requirements on that card. For instance, this player had 2 columns that were the same color and height, so they would gain 5 points for that. And then finally, the player would subtract 2 points for every die in their shelf of shame. The player with the most points would be the winner, and in the case of a tie, the player that has the lowest valued character card still left in their hand would be the winner. And if there's still a tie, the victory would be shared. Many of the card abilities on the character cards are easy to understand, but I did want to highlight a few of them to make sure that they're clear for the video. The Bad Lender allows a player to store a die on this card in between rounds or even until the end of the game if they wish. This would allow players to avoid putting a die on their shelf of shame in a pinch. But dice remaining on this card at the end of the game don't score any points or count towards any sidekick cards. The Neat Freak would allow you to put a die from your big shelf back into your box to reuse on the current round. The die selected can only be taken from the topmost space of a chosen column. The Upgrade Addict would allow you to change the value of a die. If you're using this card to upgrade the value of a die in your big shelf, it could only affect a die in the topmost space of a column. If you use the Regifter to return dice from your big shelf, the die selected can only be taken from the topmost space of a chosen column, and any die placed on this card would remain there for the rest of the game. It wouldn't score any points or count towards a sidekick majority. If you're using the cat on a die in your big shelf, it can once again only affect a die on the topmost space of any column, and the die's value can't be equal to the value below it. It has to remain greater. This card we highlighted during the video. This card would allow you to place a die of any color into any column. You could, for instance, place a green die on top of a purple die in a purple column. It doesn't change the die's color for any other purposes, like say for instance a sidekick card or first to claim card, and any dice placed in that column in the future have to match the original color. And the Shelfie Snapper allows you to reuse a card that you've used previously in the game. For the remaining cards 9 through 16, there's an appendix in the back of the rulebook that can clarify any questions you might have. Alright everybody, that was our video. Hopefully it was helpful and hopefully it was informative. If you have any questions about how to play the game, please comment below or email us directly at thediceyreview@gmail.com. And make sure and connect with us on social media or by visiting our Board Game Geek Guild. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, we'll see you at the table.